Ethan straightened his tie for the third time, staring into the mirror, the reflection staring back at him, one of deep determination. He was ready to marry Sarah Kensington, the woman he loved more than anything in the world. But love, as beautiful as it was, had not erased the deep divide between their two worlds. His world had been one of resilience and hard work. Growing up in a small apartment, above his father's auto shop, in a working-class neighborhood, he had built himself up from nothing, turning a small investment into a multi-million-dollar empire. But no matter how much success he achieved, the Kensingtons never let him forget where he came from. Sarah Kensington, on the other hand, was born into privilege. Her father, Richard Kensington, was a real estate mogul with properties stretching across the country, and her mother, Eleanor, had been bred into New York's old money elite. The Kensingtons were powerful, proud, and deeply rooted in their classist views. From the moment Ethan had stepped into their lives, they had tolerated him, but only because Sarah had insisted. Tonight, at their wedding, they would finally meet his father for the first time, and he knew exactly what they expected. To them, Michael Carter was nothing but a blue-collar worker, a man who fixed cars for a living, someone beneath their status. Ethan clenched his fists, swallowing the anger rising in his throat. His father had worked tirelessly his entire life, sacrificing everything to ensure that he could have the future he had today. To Ethan, his father was the greatest man alive. But he wasn't naive. He knew the Kensingtons wouldn't see it that way. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Sarah peeked inside, her golden curls falling over her shoulders, her wedding dress a vision of elegance. But despite the glow of the day, there was worry in her eyes. "Hey," she whispered, stepping closer. "Are you okay?" Ethan forced a small smile. "Yeah, just getting ready." Sarah reached for his hands, squeezing them gently. "They're going to love him." He let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "No, they won't," she sighed, tilting her head. "They'll come around." Ethan hesitated before replying. "Sarah, they don't want to come around. They tolerate me because they have no choice, but they'll never respect me. Not the way they respect people from their world." Sarah bit her lip. She couldn't argue with that, because deep down, she knew he was right. She had spent her entire engagement defending their love against her parents' subtle jabs, their whispered concerns, their countless attempts to introduce her to someone more suitable. She had fought them at every turn, but their minds were made of iron. And tonight, as they met Michael Carter, she feared the worst. Another knock came at the door, this time louder. Jacob Reynolds, Ethan's best man and longtime friend, poked his head inside. "Ethan," he said, his voice tight. "Your dad's here." Ethan straightened. Sarah gave his hand one last squeeze before stepping back. "I'll see you at the altar," she whispered, trying to force a smile. Ethan nodded, but as he turned towards the door, his stomach tightened, because this was it. His father had arrived, and tonight, the Kensingtons would finally see who the real Michael Carter was. The Grand Kensington estate loomed ahead, its towering gates standing as a symbol of exclusivity. The winding driveway, lined with cherry blossom trees and lanterns, led to the extravagant mansion where the wedding guests, the who's who of Newport's elite, had already begun to gather. Luxury vehicles, from sleek Rolls-Royces to matte black Bentleys, purred as chauffeurs assisted guests in their satin gowns and tailored suits. Crystal glasses clinked, and laughter danced in the evening air, a carefully curated symphony of privilege. And then, a truck rolled onto the cobblestone path. It wasn't the polished, gleaming kind seen in the garages of the elite. It was a well-kept but clearly aged Ford F-150, its metallic blue paint slightly dulled by time. The vehicle stood in stark contrast to the luxury cars lined up beside it. Michael Carter stepped out. His work-worn hands adjusted the cuffs of his modest but immaculately pressed suit. The deep lines on his face told the story of a man who had spent decades earning every cent with his own two hands. His silver hair, neatly combed back, shimmered under the estate lights. He exhaled, taking in the sheer opulence before him. He had known this wedding would be extravagant, but standing here now, surrounded by people who had never lifted a wrench in their lives, he couldn't help but feel the weight of how different his world was from theirs. But he didn't shrink. Instead, he straightened his shoulders, his back as strong as ever. Because he wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here for his son. Inside, Richard Kensington took a sip of his brandy, his posture effortless but exuding authority. The real estate tycoon had spent the evening circling his guests like a lion surveying his domain, ensuring that every moment of the event reflected the prestige of the Kensington name. Eleanor Kensington stood beside him, her diamond necklace catching the soft light of the grand chandeliers. Her sharp eyes had been scanning the room all night, looking for any imperfection. Then, she spotted something, or rather, someone. Her hand gently touched Richard's sleeve, drawing his attention to the man stepping onto their estate. Michael Carter. The moment they saw him, their expressions barely concealed their disdain. Richard set his glass down and turned to Eleanor. So, that's the father of the grooms. Eleanor's lips twitched into a polite but thin smile. Yes, she murmured, her tone laced with something unreadable. And he drove himself here. Richard chuckled under his breath. Ah, how quaint. They exchanged a glance, one that spoke volumes. This was going to be entertaining. Ethan was already halfway down the steps when he spotted his father, relief flooding his chest. Dad, he said, his voice steady but warm. Michael turned, and for the first time that evening, his expression softened. His son stood before him in a custom-fitted tuxedo, the kind of suit Michael had never had a reason to wear himself. You clean up good, kid, Michael said with a small smirk. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. Dad, thank you for coming. Michael patted his son's shoulder. Wouldn't miss it for the world. But before Ethan could say more, the Kensingtons approached. Richard's polished shoes clicked against the stone steps as he and Eleanor descended with the kind of measured grace that belonged to royalty. Their expressions were polite, their smiles carefully arranged. Ethan felt his chest tighten. Here we go. Michael Carter, Richard said, extending a hand. Welcome. Michael took the man's hand, his grip firm. Richard Kensington. Eleanor's smile never wavered, though her eyes scanned Michael's suit, his hands, even the creases that came from a day's work. It's wonderful to finally meet you, she said, with the kind of smile that dripped with underlying condescension. Michael didn't miss a beat. Likewise, ma'am. Richard motioned towards the estate. Shall we? Michael nodded, walking beside his son, into a world that wasn't meant for men like him. The moment Michael stepped inside, he felt the weight of 100 eyes. Guests subtly turned their heads from their conversations, their glances flickering towards the man who had just walked through the grand double doors. A whisper, a murmur, then another. It wasn't loud, it wasn't overt. But Michael had spent a lifetime around people like this. He could feel it. The judgment, the unspoken questions. What is he doing here? That's the groom's father? My driver dresses better than him. Michael ignored them, because he had spent his whole life ignoring people like this. Instead, he focused on his son. Ethan stayed close to his father's side, his jaw tight, as he noticed the hushed voices around them. He had expected this, but it didn't make it any less infuriating. Sarah approached, her dress flowing like silk, her face lighting up when she saw Michael. "Mr. Carter," she said warmly, taking his hands. "I'm so happy you're here." Michael's eyes softened. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, sweetheart." Sarah smiled, then turned to introduce him to a few guests. But before she could, a voice cut through the air. "Ah, the groom's father has arrived." Michael turned. Richard stood there, his expression neutral but knowing. He held a glass of whiskey in one hand, swirling it casually. "Tell me, Michael," Richard said smoothly, "what is it you do for a living?" Eleanor suppressed a smile. Ethan's stomach dropped. Michael met Richard's gaze evenly. "I own a small auto shop back home." Richard tilted his head slightly, his expression polite, yet clearly amused. "Ah," he said, as if piecing together a puzzle. "A mechanic." Michael didn't blink. "I own the shop." Richard nodded slowly. "Of course. That's admirable." Eleanor chimed in, her voice dripping in feigned interest. "How wonderful. Hard work is so important, isn't it?" Ethan clenched his fists, but before he could speak, Michael simply smiled. "Yes, ma'am. It sure is." There was no shame in his voice, no apology. Eleanor and Richard exchanged another glance. They had expected him to fumble, to blush, to look away in discomfort. But he had done none of those things, and somehow that made him even more infuriating. Ethan watched his father, a small swell of pride in his chest. Michael had walked into a world meant to belittle him, a world that thought less of him before they even knew his name. And yet, he was standing tall. Richard took another sip of his whiskey, his jaw tightening. This wasn't over. Not yet. The Grand Kensington dining hall shimmered under the golden glow of crystal chandeliers, the candlelight reflecting off fine bone china and intricately polished silverware. Every detail, from the imported floral centerpieces to the customized name cards embossed in gold, was curated to reflect the sheer wealth and exclusivity of the Kensington family. It was a place where powerful conversations were exchanged over fine wine, where connections were strengthened between politicians, corporate moguls, and elite socialites. But tonight, there was an uninvited undertone humming beneath the lavish setting, a tension so thick that even the warmest candlelight couldn't soften it. Michael Carter felt it the moment he took his seat. He wasn't naive. He knew he didn't belong in a room like this, not in the eyes of these people. But he refused to shrink. Ethan had made sure his father sat beside him and Sarah. But even then, the placement of the seating chart was deliberate. Michael wasn't seated near Richard Kensington. He wasn't at the head table, despite being the father of the groom. Instead, he had been placed at the far end of the long mahogany dining table, as if his presence was an afterthought. And the whispers started, soft at first, muted, but not unnoticed. "That's Ethan Carter's father? He's a mechanic, I heard. Oh dear. I assumed he was one of the staff. Do you think he even owns a proper tuxedo?" Can you imagine the conversation? What could he possibly talk about with this crowd? Michael pretended not to hear. It wasn't the first time he had been underestimated. It wouldn't be the last. But Ethan heard everything. His grip tightened around his fork as he forced himself to stay calm. Across from him, Sarah's jaw clenched ever so slightly, but she remained composed, as she always did in front of her parents' world. The first course was served, lobster bisque, infused with truffle oil. The servers moved with precision, setting down the bowls with delicate care. Michael watched the ritual unfold, the subtle luxury of it all. At his own shop, lunch was usually a sandwich eaten in 15 minutes between customers. There was no fine dining, No pristine white tablecloths, just the smell of motor oil, the sound of tools clanking, the satisfaction of an honest day's work. He picked up his spoon, about to take a sip when a voice cut through the chatter. "So, Michael," a deep, deliberate voice called out from across the table. "Richard Kensington, here we go." Michael set down his spoon, meeting the man's gaze. "You must be enjoying yourself," Richard said smoothly, his tone calm, yet undeniably condescending. Michael didn't flinch. "It's a beautiful evening," he said simply. Richard smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't meant to be kind at all. "I imagine this must all be quite different from what you're used to." Several guests smirked. Some chuckled under their breath. The game had begun. Ethan's knuckles turned white against his silverware. Sarah's hand subtly brushed his under the table, a silent warning. Michael, however, simply tilted his head, considering the question. "Well," he said slowly, "I imagine we all have different ideas of luxury. To some, it's this." He gestured subtly to the grand hall. "To others, it's knowing you built something with your own hands." The smirks faltered. The chuckles faded. For a brief moment, the power in the conversation shifted. But Richard wasn't done yet. Wine glasses clinked. Conversation swirled. The second course arrived, seared filet mignon with herb-roasted potatoes. It was then that the toast began. Richard stood first, raising his glass, a knowing glint in his eyes. "To my beautiful daughter, Sarah," he began, his voice filled with paternal affection that only partially masked his true intention. "And to her soon-to-be husband, Ethan Carter, a young man of ambition, drive, and, of course, great fortune." Soft laughter rippled across the table. Ethan felt it immediately. His father wasn't mentioned, but the message was clear. Richard continued, "Success is a journey, and some of us are fortunate to have had the right foundations to build upon." The words were carefully chosen, yet razor sharp. Michael said nothing, merely sipping his wine. Then Eleanor Kensington took her turn. She lifted her crystal glass, her voice laced with sweetness that felt artificial. "Ethan," she said warmly, "you've come such a long way. And Sarah, darling, I do believe you've helped him refine himself in so many ways." Refine. The word hung in the air, like a carefully placed dagger. Michael set his glass down. He could feel Ethan's anger simmering beside him. He could feel Sarah's discomfort, but he remained steady. Richard watched him, waiting for a reaction. He wouldn't get one. Michael had lived through worse than this, so instead, he turned to the waiter, casually asking, "Would you mind bringing me another drink? I imagine I'll need it." The subtle humor in his voice took the table by surprise. A few guests stifled laughter, not at him, but with him. And just like that, the Kensingtons' attempt at humiliation had lost its bite. But Ethan wasn't his father. He hadn't built up decades of resilience. So when the next whispered comment reached his ears, "Do you think his father even knows which fork to use?" Ethan snapped. His chair scraped back against the floor, the sound cutting through the air. Several heads turned. Michael's hand immediately rested on his son's arm, stopping him. "Not now," he murmured. "Not here." Ethan gritted his teeth but obeyed. Michael turned to the guests who had spoken. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Where I come from," he said simply. "It's not the fork that matters. It's the man holding it." Silence. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Ethan exhaled slowly, regaining control. Sarah squeezed his hand under the table. Across the room, Richard Kensington's expression darkened ever so slightly. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. Michael was supposed to feel small. Instead, he had remained unshaken. The Grand Kensington Estate Ballroom was alight with a golden glow, the chandeliers casting soft shadows over the lavish setting. The atmosphere was electric, a blend of high society elegance and subtle tensions simmering beneath carefully curated smiles. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, a merging of two worlds, but for some, it felt more like a battle of status and prestige. As the servers cleared away the main course, guests turned their attention toward Richard Kensington, who stood with effortless authority at the head of the long dining table. With a firm yet casual motion, he raised his crystal champagne flute, signaling the beginning of the much-anticipated wedding toasts. For a moment, the murmurs died down. All eyes turned to him. Ethan's grip on his own glass tightened, already anticipating the veiled insults that were sure to come. Richard cleared his throat, his voice rich and practiced, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his smile warm yet calculated. "Tonight, we are gathered here to celebrate the union of my beloved daughter, Sarah, and her fiancé, Ethan Carter." A round of polite applause followed. Too polite, too rehearsed, Richard continued. "As a father, there is no greater joy than watching one's daughter find a man worthy of her, a man who is strong, ambitious, and capable of providing for her." There it was, the first subtle jab, a reminder that, in Richard's eyes, wealth equaled worth. Ethan took a slow breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He wouldn't give Richard the satisfaction. Richard lifted his glass slightly. "Ethan, you are a fine young man. You've built a successful career, against all odds, and I commend you for that." Michael Carter, seated a few spots down, noticed the careful emphasis on "against all odds." He had heard this kind of tone many times before, the kind that disguised condescension as admiration. Richard went on. "Success, of course, requires a strong foundation, and I must say, I am grateful that Sarah has been a guiding force in helping Ethan navigate the more refined aspects of our world." A ripple of laughter spread across the room. Some guests chuckled knowingly, others smirked. Ethan's jaw clenched. Sarah's fingers tightened around his wrist, beneath the table. A silent plea to stay composed. Before the tension could settle, Eleanor Kensington gracefully rose, her sequined gown shimmering as she lifted her own glass. "If I may," she said smoothly, flashing a practiced smile, "I would like to say a few words about my dear daughter." The murmurs died down again. Eleanor's presence commanded attention. "Sarah, my love, you have always been a woman of class, elegance, and poise. From the moment you were born, I knew you were destined for great things. You have a deep sense of responsibility and an eye for refinement, which is why it is no surprise that you found someone who could truly benefit from your influence." The words were honeyed poison. Michael, who had remained silent so far, felt his grip on his napkin tighten under the table. Influence. The implication was clear. Sarah had polished Ethan into being someone suitable for this world. Eleanor continued, "Love, after all, is about growth. And when we look at our children, we hope that they grow in ways that make us proud. And I must say, Ethan, you have certainly grown." A few guests smiled slyly, whispering among themselves. At the far end of the table, Michael Carter remained still, his expression unreadable. He had expected this. This was a game he had seen before, but he wasn't here to play it. Instead, he picked up his glass, sipping his champagne with quiet composure. They wanted a reaction from him. They weren't going to get one. Ethan, however, was struggling. His hands curled into tight fists beneath the table, his pulse quickening with every second that passed. Sarah, sensing his frustration, leaned in slightly. Breathe, she murmured softly. Not here. He exhaled, trying to ignore the heat rising in his chest. The toasts continued, one after another, each guest taking turns raising their glasses. Some were genuine well-wishers, offering warm words of love and support. But others used the opportunity to weave in their own brand of social superiority. I must say it's truly inspiring to see someone like Ethan rise so far. Just goes to show that with enough hard work, anything is possible. Ethan, you are proof that even the humblest beginnings don't have to hold one back. If one is determined enough, of course. Each word dripped with backhanded compliments, and each one only fueled the fire inside Ethan. Michael, watching his son, finally set his glass down and spoke softly, only loud enough for Ethan to hear. They're testing you, son? I know, Ethan whispered back. Then don't let them win. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second. When he opened them, he nodded. Calm, steady, collected. He wouldn't let them win. As the toasts wound down, Richard stood once more, this time with an almost theatrical sigh. Well, he mused, feigning thoughtfulness. We've heard many wonderful words tonight, but I must say, I am still quite curious about something. Ethan felt the shift in the air. He knew what was coming next. Richard turned his gaze to Michael Carter, a smirk playing at his lips. Michael, you've been rather quiet tonight, he said. Surely, as the father of the groom, you have a few words to share? Silence. The trap was set. All eyes turned to Michael, waiting, watching, anticipating his failure. Ethan gritted his teeth. Sarah's breath hitched. Michael, however, he simply picked up his glass, rising to his feet with deliberate ease. He met Richard's gaze. Then he looked around the room, making eye contact with several guests, and then, with a slow smile, he said, I've found that the best words aren't the loudest nor the longest. They're simply the ones that matter. A beat of silence, a shift. Richard blinked. The crowd leaned in slightly, as if waiting for more. Michael simply lifted his glass. To Ethan and Sarah, he said. May they always know their worth, no matter who questions it. And with that, he sat back down. The grand ballroom of the Kensington estate still echoed with the remnants of Michael Carter's final words. His toast, though brief, had left an undeniable impression. Some guests had nodded in appreciation, while others, particularly Richard and Eleanor, fought to mask their irritation. Yet beneath the polished smiles and sparkling chandeliers, the tension had only grown sharper. Ethan knew it was coming. The moment where the gloves would come off, where Richard would no longer pretend to be civil. The subtle jabs were over. Now, it was about direct humiliation. Michael Carter, however, remained composed. Richard rose once more, forcing a light chuckle. Well, that certainly was succinct, he said, swirling the champagne in his glass. But perhaps that's to be expected. After all, actions speak louder than words, don't they? A few guests chuckled. Others shifted, sensing where this was going. Michael simply tilted his head. Richard's smirk widened. You know, Michael, he continued, voice smooth with false curiosity. I've been meaning to ask, how does a man of your caliber end up raising a son like Ethan? The air grew heavy. Sarah's grip tightened on Ethan's arm. Ethan could feel the blood pounding in his ears. Michael, still calm, raised an eyebrow. I'm afraid I don't follow. Richard set down his glass, steepling his fingers. I mean, it's truly fascinating, isn't it? A man who built himself from nothing, pulling himself up by his bootstraps, as they say, only to settle. I mean, no offense, of course, he added, voice dripping with condescension. Michael's jaw tightened slightly, so subtle that only Ethan noticed. Richard leaned in, relishing the moment. A man with your intelligence, your work ethic, you could have been so much more. But instead, you chose to remain. What was it again? A beat. Then Eleanor finished the sentence for him. A mechanic. The word hung in the air, heavier than the crystal chandeliers above them. Soft murmurs rippled through the room. Ethan's breath came in slow, controlled measures. Michael, however, did not flinch. Instead, he met Richard's gaze head-on. Yes, he said evenly. A mechanic. The simple statement carried no shame, no apology. Richard feigned surprise. Fascinating. Truly fascinating. Tell me, Michael, was there never a time when you wanted more? Michael smiled, a slow, measured smile. I wanted what mattered. A slight shift among the guests. Some furrowed their brows. Others looked intrigued. Richard wasn't finished. He gestured grandly. But surely a man of your talents must have had opportunities. I mean, in our world, we believe that hard work should lead to, well, greater things. Eleanor sighed dramatically. We're simply trying to understand, Michael, she said, tilting her head. Why settle for so little when you clearly could have reached so much higher? Michael set his glass down carefully. His next words were calm, controlled, dangerous in their quiet intensity. I suppose it depends on how you define higher, Eleanor. Another shift in the room. A few guests murmured in agreement. Ethan felt a flicker of satisfaction. His father wasn't just enduring this attack. He was controlling the conversation. But Richard wasn't ready to back down. Richard folded his hands. So, you sacrificed ambition? For what? Fatherhood? He chuckled, shaking his head. Tell me, Michael, was it worth it? Ethan snapped. His chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood abruptly. That's enough, he said, voice low and tight with fury. The room fell silent. A beat passed. Then, Richard smirked. Oh dear, he mused. Have I struck a nerve? Sarah stood up beside Ethan. You've done more than that, Dad, she said, voice sharp and unwavering. You've embarrassed yourself. A hush fell over the room. Eleanor let out a soft gasp, as if personally offended. Sarah, she said, scandalized. Sarah ignored her. You can pretend this is about class, about success, about what's best for me. But we both know the truth. Richard's smile faded. You're not afraid that Ethan won't be enough for me, Sarah continued. You're afraid he is. Eleanor rose abruptly. Sarah, that's quite enough. No, Sarah shot back, holding her ground. Enough is when you belittle a good man for no reason. Enough is when you decide that a person's worth is measured by their bank account. Enough is when you treat someone as less than just because they don't live in your world. A few guests exchanged uneasy glances. Others nodded slightly, as if suddenly reevaluating the situation. Ethan's chest swelled with pride. Sarah's voice softened slightly. I love you, Dad, but I refuse to let you define Ethan or his father by your standards. The tension peaked. Richard looked at Sarah, then at Ethan, then finally at Michael. For a moment, it seemed like he might push further. But then, he simply sighed. Very well, he said, lifting his glass once more. To new beginnings, then. A forced chuckle spread through the room, as some guests awkwardly joined the toast. But the damage had been done. Michael had not been humiliated. Richard had. As soon as the toast ended, Ethan turned to his father. I'm sorry, Dad, he muttered. Michael patted his shoulder. There's nothing to apologize for, son, he said quietly. Sarah touched Ethan's hand. Let's go get some air, she whispered. He nodded. As they made their way to the terrace, Ethan caught a glimpse of Richard and Eleanor in hushed conversation. They weren't finished. Not yet. The tension from the confrontation still lingered in the grand ballroom, like the aftermath of an unseen storm. Conversations resumed, but they felt different, more forced, more cautious. The social hierarchy that once seemed unshakable had wavered. Ethan and Sarah had retreated to the terrace for fresh air, while Michael remained seated, unfazed. He wasn't a man who needed validation from strangers in expensive suits. But Richard Kensington wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. As the wedding guests moved towards the grand reception hall, where the next phase of the celebration was to unfold, Richard signaled to one of his associates. Inside, an extravagant table had been set up for the gift presentation. Unlike typical weddings, where gifts were discreetly placed in a designated area, the Kensingtons had decided that each guest should present their gift in front of everyone. A tradition designed not to celebrate love, but to showcase status. One by one, the guests took turns revealing their contributions to the newlyweds. A diamond-studded Rolex from a Wall Street mogul, a month-long European honeymoon package from an old family friend, stock shares from a corporate executive. Each gift was grander than the last. A hush fell as an oil magnate stepped forward. "Well," he drawled, handing Ethan a sealed envelope. "This is just a little something to help you both settle into married life." Ethan opened it. Inside was a deed to a vacation home in the Hamptons. Gasps rippled through the room. Eleanor Kensington beamed with pride. Richard, standing beside her, cast a knowing glance toward Michael Carter. The trap was set. Ethan had seen enough. He exchanged a glance with Sarah, then turned to his father. "Dad," he said, loud enough for the room to hear, "do you want to go next?" Michael nodded, standing up slowly. Immediately, whispers broke out. "Finally, let's see what the mechanic brought. I bet it's something practical. Maybe a lifetime supply of motor oil?" Richard cleared his throat. "Ah, yes," he said, feigning politeness. "Michael, I admit, I'm quite curious. Given that you raised such a remarkable son, I can only imagine what a man of your background has chosen to contribute." A thinly veiled challenge. Michael Carter did not react. Instead, he gestured to a modest package sitting at the edge of the table. Unlike the gifts wrapped in shimmering gold paper or placed in velvet-lined boxes, his was wrapped in simple brown paper. No ribbons, no embellishments. Eleanor frowned in disapproval. Sarah, however, gripped Ethan's hand. Michael walked forward, placing the package in front of his son and future daughter-in-law. "This," he said, his voice steady, "is something that has been in my family for generations." The room fell silent. Ethan reached forward, carefully unwrapping the package. As the last layer of paper fell away, a hushed gasp spread through the crowd. It was a painting, an oil painting, its colors rich and bold, capturing a landscape that felt both powerful and haunting. Even those unfamiliar with fine art could sense its significance. But those who were familiar looked stunned. Sarah covered her mouth. "Is this?" she whispered, turning to Ethan. Ethan nodded slowly. Michael Carter's voice was calm as he spoke. "This painting was passed down to me by my grandfather, and before him, it belonged to his father. It has remained in our family for over a century." A heavy silence settled over the room. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her champagne glass. Richard, for the first time that evening, looked genuinely surprised, because he knew exactly what he was looking at. A masterpiece. A painting created by one of the most celebrated African-American artists in history. A man whose works now sold for millions. A few guests, realizing the significance, started whispering, "Wait, is that real?" There's no way. Is he serious? That artist's pieces are in museums? Richard forced a laugh. Well, well, he said, masking his unease. Michael, I must say this is unexpected. Michael simply smiled. I thought it was important that Ethan and Sarah start their marriage with something meaningful, something with history. Richard tilted his head. Yes, quite. But the gears in his mind were already spinning. If this painting was authentic, then Michael Carter, a mere mechanic, had been sitting on a fortune for years. Richard wasn't about to let that go unnoticed. The murmurs grew louder. Some guests exchanged impressed glances, while others looked skeptical. A businessman turned to Michael. You mean to tell us, he said, that you've had this all these years, and you never sold it? Michael shook his head. I didn't see the need. A woman in a diamond necklace scoffed. But why? Michael looked at his son. Because some things, he said simply, are worth more than money. A murmur rippled through the room. Richard, however, saw an opportunity. Fascinating, he said, stepping forward. But, Michael, surely you must have known the value of this painting. Michael met his gaze. I did. Richard smiled thinly. Then why, may I ask, did you continue working as a mechanic? The words hung in the air. Several guests nodded in agreement. It was a question that demanded an answer. Eleanor folded her arms, watching intently. Sarah tensed. But Michael Carter, he simply smiled, because he knew exactly what came next, and so would they. A hush fell over the room, as all eyes were fixed on the painting, a masterpiece hidden in plain sight. The bold strokes, the depth of color, and the unmistakable signature in the bottom corner left no doubt. This wasn't just any painting. It was a lost treasure from one of the most revered African-American artists in history, an artist whose works hung in museums, whose paintings were considered national treasures, and whose legacy had shaped generations. And Michael Carter had just presented it as a wedding gift. For the first time that evening, the tone of the room had shifted. There was no mockery, no thinly veiled insults, just stunned silence. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she traced the artist's signature with her fingers. This is, she whispered. This is real, isn't it? Ethan nodded slowly, his throat tight. Yes, he murmured. Jacob Reynolds, Ethan's best man, and a man well versed in the art world, was the first to break the silence. My God, Jacob exhaled, stepping closer. This is a Harrison Whitmore original. The mention of the name sent a ripple through the guests. Whitmore's works were priceless. His paintings were displayed in the Smithsonian, the Met, and private collections owned by billionaires. A murmur spread through the room like wildfire. That can't be. Whitmore's pieces are worth millions. How did he even get his hands on something like this? Eleanor Kensington visibly paled. Richard, however, had barely moved. His sharp gaze flickered from the painting to Michael Carter, his mind racing. Because this changed everything. Michael remained calm as he addressed the growing crowd. This painting, he said, his voice steady, has been in my family for over 100 years. My grandfather was a close friend of Harrison Whitmore. In the early days of his career, when the art world refused to recognize a black artist's talent, my great-grandfather provided him with a space to paint, food to eat, and the encouragement he needed to keep going. As a token of gratitude, he gifted this to our family. A hush fell. The painting wasn't just a valuable work of art. It was a symbol of loyalty, of history, of unshakable integrity. Michael's voice remained steady. This painting could have been sold 100 times over. My father could have used it to escape poverty. I could have used it to build a different life. But some things are more valuable than money. Some things, he looked at Ethan, are meant to be passed down. A new kind of silence followed, one of understanding. But Richard Kensington wasn't ready to surrender. Well, Richard finally spoke, his voice carefully measured. That's certainly quite the story. Michael tilted his head slightly. You don't believe me. Richard chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Oh, I believe it's real, all right. The painting speaks for itself. What I find fascinating, however, is that you've had a literal fortune at your fingertips all these years, yet, instead of leveraging it, you chose to remain a mechanic. The tone of the room darkened. Michael's face remained unreadable. Ethan, however, had had enough. My father is a man of principle, Ethan said coldly. Something you wouldn't understand, Richard smirked. Oh, I understand principle just fine. What I don't understand is wasted potential. He turned back to Michael. So, tell me, Michael, if you had something this valuable, why didn't you ever use it to build a better life for yourself, for your son? Eleanor nodded in agreement. A fascinating question, she mused. Surely, with the right investment, you wouldn't have had to struggle. A few guests murmured in agreement. Sarah's nails dug into her palm. Stop, she whispered. Michael remained unmoved. He met Richard's gaze steadily and said, I never struggled. The words were simple, but they cut through the room like a blade. You assume, Michael continued, that because I worked with my hands, because I didn't chase wealth, that I struggled. He shook his head. But you don't understand the first thing about real wealth. Richard's jaw tightened. Michael took a step forward. I built a life for my son. I taught him the value of hard work. I showed him what it means to be a man of honor. And I did it, without needing to flaunt my success. His gaze swept the room. The truth is, I could have sold this painting a long time ago. And I could have been wealthy, by your definition. But I would have lost something more important. He turned back to Ethan. I would have lost the chance to teach my son that real success isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the choices you make when no one is watching. Silence. A new kind of silence, not one of disbelief, but of respect. Even some of Richard's closest associates looked uncertain, because Michael Carter had just done something no one had ever done before. He had made Richard Kensington look small. Richard let out a strained chuckle. Well, he said, grasping for control, I suppose that's one way of looking at it. But he had already lost the room. A few guests were openly nodding in agreement with Michael. Others were whispering to their spouses. And then, one of the high-profile guests, a real estate mogul, stood up. I have to say, Michael, he said, I misjudged you. Another guest, a well-known lawyer, joined in. As did I. One by one, the social dynamic began to shift, and Richard Kensington, for the first time in his life, was losing control. Sarah, emboldened by the moment, stood tall. Dad, she said, her voice unwavering. You spent this entire night trying to humiliate Michael. She stepped closer. And all you did was prove why he's a better man than you. Richard's face hardened. Eleanor gasped. Sarah, how dare you? No, Mom, Sarah said. Enough. She turned to Ethan and Michael. I'm done playing their game. Ethan squeezed her hand. So am I. Michael nodded, pride shining in his eyes. They didn't need validation, because they had already won. And Richard Kensington knew it. The room was no longer filled with mockery. Now, it was filled with awe. The painting, a priceless artifact of history, stood as an undeniable testament to everything Michael Carter had just said. The whispers had turned to respect. The glances once filled with pity and condescension were now replaced with uncertainty. Even Eleanor Kensington, who had spent the entire evening barely concealing her disdain, looked shaken. Sarah glanced at her mother, waiting for her to speak. But for the first time in her life, Eleanor was silent. It was Richard who broke the silence. "I still don't believe it," he said, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. Michael turned his gaze toward him, steady, unwavering. "You don't have to," Michael said simply. "The truth doesn't need your approval." Ethan fought the urge to smirk. His father had just dismantled Richard Kensington's entire belief system with a single sentence. Richard exhaled sharply, looking around the room, trying to gauge his audience. But the people who had once hung on his every word now looked hesitant. Because there was one thing Richard Kensington feared more than anything: losing control of the narrative. Eleanor cleared her throat, her eyes scanning the painting again. This is a remarkable piece," she said carefully, forcing her voice into neutrality. Michael gave a slight nod. "It is." Eleanor pursed her lips. "And you've had this in your family all this time?" "Yes." Her gaze flickered to her husband, searching for answers he didn't have. Because this wasn't part of their script. They had expected to humiliate Michael Carter. They had expected to prove his inferiority. They had not expected this. Sarah, watching her mother struggle to regain composure, finally spoke up. "What are you trying to say, Mom?" Eleanor hesitated, then finally let the words slip. "Well, I just find it interesting," she said smoothly, "that someone would sit on such wealth and choose not to use it." A sharp breath. Ethan turned to her, his expression dark. "Are you implying something?" Eleanor smiled, but it wasn't kind. It was the smile of a woman who wasn't ready to surrender. "I'm merely saying," Eleanor said sweetly, "that if this is real, and I do mean if, then it raises some questions, doesn't it?" The room went still. Michael raised an eyebrow. "Such as?" Eleanor tilted her head, her voice deliberately soft. "Where exactly did this painting come from?" The words landed like a grenade. Ethan stiffened. Sarah inhaled sharply. "Mother." "I mean no offense," Eleanor said smoothly, "but art pieces of this caliber don't just sit in private homes unnoticed." She turned back to Michael. "Have you ever had this piece authenticated?" Michael's face remained calm. "Yes." Eleanor blinked. Clearly she had expected a different answer. Michael continued, his voice steady. "I had it authenticated years ago. And not just once. 3 different times." A murmur spread through the crowd. Jacob, Ethan's best man, and a tech entrepreneur with a deep love for art, took a step forward. "If that's true," Jacob said, rubbing his chin, "then this isn't just any painting. This is a national artifact." Eleanor's nails dug into her palm. Sarah narrowed her eyes. "Why does that bother you, Mom?" Eleanor stiffened. "I'm not bothered," Eleanor said, her voice just a bit too sharp. Sarah smirked. "Oh, I think you are." Richard, sensing his wife was losing ground, took a step forward. He was a businessman, a man used to winning negotiations, and he knew how to manipulate a room. "Let's be honest," Richard said smoothly. "None of us are art experts. But let's suppose for a moment that this painting is everything you claim it is." His gaze turned sharp. "If that's true, then why hasn't anyone ever heard of it?" Silence. Michael took his time answering. "Because my family never cared about the limelight," Michael said. "We weren't looking for validation. We weren't looking to sell. We were looking to preserve history, not profit from it." Richard let out a cold chuckle. "Well," he said, "that's noble." He turned to the guests. "But let's look at the bigger picture, shall we?" He gestured at Michael. Here's a man who claims to have a painting worth millions. And yet, instead of securing his son's future with it, he chose to, what? Work in a garage? Sarah's fists clenched. Michael, however, remained unshaken. I chose to teach my son values, Michael said evenly. Not just wealth. Richard wasn't satisfied. I'm just saying, Richard said, his voice laced with feigned concern, that it's a bit convenient, isn't it? Michael tilted his head slightly. What is? That you conveniently reveal this on the night of your son's wedding. Gasps. Sarah's face darkened. You think he's lying? Richard raised his hands in mock surrender. I didn't say that, he said, a smirk playing on his lips. I'm just wondering if this is all just theatrics. Ethan snapped. Enough, Ethan said, his voice low, firm. Richard paused. Ethan stepped forward, looking his future father-in-law in the eye. You've spent this entire night trying to humiliate my father, Ethan said. You've thrown insults, mockery, and now you're trying to suggest he's some kind of fraud? Richard didn't respond. Ethan shook his head. You know what I see, Richard, Ethan said. Richard's jaw tightened. I see a man who built his entire life around the idea that power and wealth make you superior. And for the first time, you're realizing you were wrong. Richard's fists clenched at his sides. Ethan let out a breath, then turned to Sarah. I think we're done here. Sarah didn't hesitate. Agreed. Richard's face paled. You can't just... We can, Sarah said coldly. She turned to Michael. Are you ready to go? Michael nodded. Richard and Eleanor watched in horror as their daughter walked away. And as Ethan, Michael, and Sarah left the grand estate, Richard Kensington knew one thing for certain. He had just lost. The silence in the grand ballroom was deafening. The whispers that had filled the air earlier, mocking Michael Carter, questioning his worth, had disappeared. In their place was something else. Uncertainty, doubt, and most of all, respect. Michael didn't need to demand it. He didn't need to fight for it. He had earned it. Ethan and Sarah stood beside him, unshaken, while Richard and Eleanor Kensington looked on, their expressions frozen in something they had never expected to feel. Defeat. Richard clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching at his sides. For years, he had commanded every room he entered. He had built an empire on his ability to control the narrative, to make people believe in his version of the truth. But now, the truth stood right in front of him. And no matter how much he wanted to bury it, no matter how much he wanted to twist it into something ugly, he couldn't, because the entire room had seen it unfold. A painting worth millions, kept hidden not out of greed, but out of principle. A man worth more than any fortune Richard Kensington could ever build. And now, people were starting to see it. People who had once hung on his every word. People who had once looked up to him. People who were now turning away. Across the ballroom, the shift in allegiance was almost tangible. Guests who had once sneered at Michael now exchanged glances of admiration. A woman in a designer gown leaned toward her husband. You know, she whispered, I think we may have misjudged Mr. Carter. Her husband nodded, adjusting the cufflinks on his tailored sleeve. He's a man of integrity, he said. Something this family could learn a thing or two about. Not far away, another guest murmured, I can't believe we spent the night laughing at a man who... He shook his head. I think he's the only one in this room who actually knows what matters. Even Jacob Reynolds, Ethan's best man, and a self-made CEO, had noticed the shift. He walked up to Michael, extending a firm hand. Mr. Carter, Jacob said, his voice steady, I just want to say, I respect the hell out of you." Michael took the handshake without hesitation. "Thank you," he said simply. But before anyone could say more, Richard slammed his glass down onto the table. The sharp sound cut through the room, snapping every head in his direction. His face was red, his jaw tight, his hands shaking with frustration. And in that moment, Ethan realized something. Richard Kensington was unraveling. "I don't believe this," Richard muttered under his breath. Eleanor grabbed his arm. "Richard, stop," she whispered. But he shrugged her off. "No," Richard said louder this time. "I refuse to sit here and watch my daughter." He gestured sharply at Sarah. "Throw her future away. For a man who thinks nobility comes from scrubbing grease off of car engines." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Sarah froze. Ethan took a step forward, his muscles tensing. Michael, however, stayed still. He had faced worse. Richard wasn't finished. "I have spent my entire life," Richard continued, "building something. Something that actually matters. Something that provides for a family. Something that ensures security, power, and influence." He turned to Sarah, his voice sharp. "And you're willing to throw all of that away for this?" Sarah didn't flinch, but she didn't back down either. She took a deep breath, her voice calm, steady, and more powerful than Richard's rage could ever be. "Yes," she said simply. Richard stared at her. Eleanor gasped. The room was silent again. But Sarah wasn't finished. "I'd rather build something real," Sarah said, "than spend my life trapped in a house of cards." A murmur swept through the guests. Even Richard's closest allies, his business partners, his investors, were watching him differently now. They weren't nodding in agreement. They were watching him fall. Ethan took Sarah's hand, then turned to Richard. "I used to respect you," Ethan said. "I used to think you were a man who had built something worth admiring." His expression darkened. "But now, I see it for what it is." Richard stiffened. "You built a cage, Richard," Ethan said. "A golden one, sure. But a cage nonetheless." He looked around the room. "And everyone here? They've spent their lives convincing themselves that they're free." He turned back to Richard. "But they're not, are they?" Richard's face turned pale. He opened his mouth. To argue, to fight, to regain control. But for the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. Because deep down, he knew Ethan was right. Michael exhaled slowly, then looked at his son. "I think we're done here," he said. Ethan nodded. Sarah squeezed his hand, and together, they turned toward the doors. Richard's voice cut through the silence. "If you leave now," he said, "you'll regret it." Sarah paused. Ethan did not. But Michael turned back. And for the first time that night, he addressed Richard directly. "I've spent my whole life listening to men like you," Michael said. "Men who believe money is the only measure of success." Richard's jaw tightened. Michael took a step closer. "But let me tell you something," he said. "Success isn't about power. It isn't about fear. Oh, it isn't about controlling the people around you." Michael tilted his head. "You want to know what real power looks like, Richard?" Richard didn't respond. Michael glanced at Ethan and Sarah. "It looks like knowing who you are," Michael said, "and never needing anyone's permission to be that person." With that, Michael turned. And this time, no one tried to stop him, because the power in the room had shifted. And for the first time, it wasn't in Richard Kensington's hands. The grand ballroom wasn't silent anymore. It was alive with whispers. Guests, once firm believers in Richard Kensington's power, were now exchanging glances of uncertainty. Some looked at Michael Carter with newfound respect. Others watched Richard with hesitation, as if finally seeing through the man they had admired for years. Richard felt it. He wasn't used to losing control. Not like this. Not in front of his people. His hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight with barely contained rage. He had planned this night so carefully. Or so he thought. This was supposed to be the night he proved that Ethan Carter was beneath them. Instead, it had become the night that Michael Carter, a man he had dismissed as nothing, had taken everything from him. Richard's breathing quickened, his chest rising and falling, as he scanned the crowd, searching for allies. But for the first time in his life, he saw nothing but doubt. He couldn't let this happen. He wouldn't. Richard slammed his glass down onto the table. The sharp clink of crystal meeting marble cut through the murmurs, snapping every head in his direction. "I refuse," Richard said, his voice low, controlled, dangerous. Eleanor stiffened beside him, her manicured fingers gripping his arm. "Richard," she hissed, but he ignored her. He turned his gaze toward Michael. "You think you've won," Richard said, his voice dripping with venom. Michael didn't answer. He simply watched. The restraint in his silence infuriated Richard even more. Richard straightened, adjusting the cuffs of his $1,000 suit, his every movement precise and calculated. "I will not stand here," Richard continued, "and allow my daughter to be manipulated by a man who has spent his life covered in grease and dirt." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Sarah's eyes darkened. Ethan took a step forward. But Michael? He remained perfectly still. The only shift in his expression was a small, knowing smile. A smile that said, "I've seen men like you before, and I've never been afraid of them." And that was what finally made Richard snap. Richard turned toward the guests, his arms outstretched. "Look at him," Richard shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Look at what we're doing. We are standing here, in one of the most prestigious venues in the country, celebrating the union of two families that should represent excellence, wealth, and power." He turned sharply back toward Ethan, his face contorted with disgust. "And yet we are expected to accept this? A mechanic? A man who works with his hands? A man whose legacy is built on nothing but oil stains and rusted engines?" Sarah stepped forward. "That's enough," she said, her voice calm but firm. Richard ignored her. He pointed a finger at Michael. "Tell me," Richard said, his voice a low growl. "Tell me right now, Carter. Was this your plan all along? To fool us all? To make us think you were small, so that you could humiliate us when it mattered most?" Michael exhaled slowly. He met Richard's gaze with unwavering composure. And then he spoke. "I don't need to fool anyone, Richard," Michael said. "You did that all by yourself." Silence engulfed the room once more. Richard's nostrils flared. Michael took a step forward, his movements measured, deliberate. "I never needed to prove anything," Michael continued, his voice even. "Not to you, not to anyone. But the fact that you're standing here, unraveling, tells me one thing, Richard." He paused, letting the moment stretch, and then he said, "You're scared." Richard staggered back, his mouth opening, closing. But no words came out. Sarah, standing tall beside Ethan, took a breath, and then she delivered the final blow. "No, Dad," she said. "You're not scared of Michael." She shook her head. "You're scared of the truth." A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. For the first time that night, Richard looked lost. One by one, guests who had once nodded along with his every word were now looking away. A woman in a sapphire gown leaned toward her husband. "I never realized how desperate he is," she whispered. Another man, one of Richard's longtime business partners, exhaled sharply. "He's making a fool of himself," he muttered. Jacob Reynolds, who had watched the entire spectacle unfold, took a step toward Ethan. "Well," Jacob said, his voice low, "I think it's safe to say your future father-in-law just committed social suicide." Ethan didn't smile, because this wasn't funny. This was tragic. For all his power, all his money, all his ruthless ambition, Richard Kensington had just lost the one thing he valued most: control. And he had no one to blame but himself. Richard was still standing there, breathing heavily, waiting for someone to take his side. No one did. Sarah turned to Ethan. "I think we're done here," she said. Ethan nodded. Together they turned toward Michael. "Let's go," Ethan said. And just like that, they walked away. "Sarah," Richard called, his voice hoarse. She paused, but she didn't turn around. "If you walk away now," Richard said, his voice cracking, "you'll lose everything we've given you." For a moment, there was only silence. And then, Sarah turned her head slightly. "I don't need it," she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried more power than any threat Richard had ever made. And with that, she walked out. Michael followed. Ethan did too. And behind them, Richard Kensington stood frozen, alone. For the first time in his life, the air inside the grand ballroom was suffocating. Even with its shimmering chandeliers, towering floral arrangements, and the polished elegance of its decor, the room felt heavy, not from the weight of wealth, but from something far more crushing: humiliation. And for the first time, it wasn't Michael Carter who was humiliated. It was Richard Kensington. The man who had once commanded unwavering respect was now the center of whispers, stolen glances, and silent judgment. Ethan and Sarah stood tall, side by side. As their decision hung in the air like an unspoken verdict, they were leaving, and they weren't coming back. Richard stepped forward, his composure barely holding together. "Sarah," he said, his voice tight, the strain of the night creeping into his usually controlled tone. "You're making a mistake." She didn't flinch. Ethan exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "No," he said. "You did that all by yourself." Eleanor grabbed Richard's arm, her eyes wide with panic. She had been silent for most of the evening, watching as her husband systematically destroyed the very foundation of their family. But now, with Sarah truly leaving, she could feel the ground shifting beneath her. "Sarah," Eleanor pleaded, her voice softer than Richard's, but just as desperate. "Sweetheart, think about what you're doing." Sarah finally turned to face her mother. "I have," she said. "For years." She paused, her voice steady. "And I've finally figured out that I don't need to spend the rest of my life trying to meet expectations that were never mine to begin with." The whispers grew louder. Some guests, those still loyal to Richard, watched in stunned disbelief, while others exchanged knowing glances. A few even nodded in admiration. The tide had shifted. What was once Richard Kensington's world was now crumbling in real time. And everyone knew it. Michael, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "I didn't come here to take anything from you, Richard," he said. Richard let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, is that what you think?" he sneered. "That I believe you came here with good intentions? You humiliated me in front of my own people. I did nothing." Michael interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "You humiliated yourself?" Richard stiffened. Michael tilted his head slightly, as if observing something fascinating. "You stood in this room," Michael continued, "surrounded by the people you thought would always be on your side, and you let them see the truth." He gestured subtly toward the guests. "You showed them who you really are." Richard's jaw tightened, his face turning red with rage. "I built this world," he hissed. Michael nodded. Yes, he said. And now you're watching it fall apart. Sarah and Ethan turned toward the exit. Michael followed, and behind them, the guests watched. Some stood still, too afraid to move, too afraid to pick a side. Others began to murmur amongst themselves, debating whether to stay or leave. But one thing was clear. This night would never be forgotten. Richard took a step forward, his hands balled into fists. Sarah. He tried one last time. She paused. But she didn't turn around. Eleanor reached out. Please, she whispered. Don't go like this. Sarah finally looked back, just long enough to say, There's no other way. And with that, they walked out. The night air was cool and refreshing, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension they had just escaped. Ethan exhaled, his grip on Sarah's hand never loosening. Michael stood beside them, looking up at the sky for a moment before speaking. Well, he said, his voice laced with a hint of amusement. That was eventful. Sarah let out a short laugh, shaking her head. I can't believe we actually did it, she said. Michael smiled. Yes, you can. Ethan looked at his father. Thank you, he said, sincerity clear in his voice. Michael placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. You never have to thank me for standing beside you, he said. That's what family does. Sarah wiped at her eyes, her emotions catching up to her. So, she said, looking between them. What now? Ethan exhaled deeply. Now, he said, we build something better. Michael nodded. Then let's get started. And with that, they left not just a wedding, but an entire world behind. Because for the first time, they weren't walking away. They were walking towards something greater. The sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shore was soothing. It was a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded only a week ago. Ethan Carter stood on the balcony of his new home, a modest but beautiful seaside house in Cape Cod. The salty breeze brushed against his skin as he sipped his coffee, his mind still adjusting to the freedom that came with walking away from his wedding night. For the first time in his life, he wasn't living under anyone else's expectations. And yet, the weight of that reality was just beginning to sink in. Behind him, Sarah walked out onto the balcony, wrapping a warm blanket around herself. Her blonde hair was slightly tousled from sleep, and there was a soft smile on her lips as she looked at him. You're thinking again, she teased. Ethan chuckled, turning to her. Guilty as charged. She leaned against him, letting her head rest on his shoulder. I know this isn't where we thought we'd be, she murmured. But I wouldn't trade it for anything. Ethan exhaled, wrapping an arm around her waist. Neither would I. They stood there for a long moment, watching as the sun began to rise over the horizon, signaling a new chapter in their lives. Later that day, Ethan drove to his father's garage. Michael Carter had returned to work almost immediately after the wedding fiasco, choosing to focus on what had always grounded him, his love for fixing things. Ethan stepped inside the garage, inhaling the familiar scent of oil, rubber, and metal. The place was alive. Mechanics moved around efficiently. Customers chatted as they waited for their cars to be serviced, and the sound of tools echoed through the space. Michael, wearing his grease-stained coveralls, was bent over an engine, his hands working with effortless precision. Dad, Ethan called out. Michael looked up, smiling as he wiped his hands on a rag. Well, if it isn't the runaway groom, he joked. Ethan laughed, shaking his head. I like to think of it as a strategic escape. Michael chuckled, motioning for Ethan to follow him into his small office, a simple room cluttered with paperwork, old photos, and a coffee machine that looked as old as time itself. So, Michael said, leaning against his desk, How does it feel to finally be free? Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. It feels right, he admitted, but also terrifying. Michael nodded knowingly. That's the thing about doing the right thing, he said. It doesn't always come with immediate comfort, but it does come with peace. Ethan absorbed his father's words, realizing just how true they were. You always know what to say, don't you? Ethan smirked. Michael shrugged. Not always, but I do know that you're on the right path. The next few weeks were filled with decisions, challenges, and new beginnings. Ethan and Sarah had agreed on one thing. They weren't going to live under anyone's shadow anymore. They wanted to build something real, something that could help others the way Ethan had once needed help when he was younger. That's when the idea for the Carter Foundation was born. Ethan used his business acumen and connections to set up a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping young entrepreneurs from underprivileged backgrounds get the resources they needed to start their own businesses. Sarah, with her background in philanthropy and social work, took charge of structuring the programs, ensuring that the foundation wasn't just about financial aid, but also about mentorship, education, and opportunity. Together, they created a movement, one that stood for everything Richard Kensington had dismissed. 3 months later, the Carter Foundation held its first gala. It wasn't hosted in a grand ballroom or at an extravagant estate. Instead, it was held in an industrial-style event space in downtown Boston, surrounded by people who truly believed in the cause. Michael, dressed in a simple yet elegant suit, stood proudly at the back of the room, watching as Ethan and Sarah stood on stage, addressing a crowd that had gathered not because of status, but because of shared purpose. I grew up knowing what it's like to have nothing, Ethan told the audience, and I know how hard it is to break through barriers when the world tells you that you don't belong. He glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. That's why we're here tonight, to prove that success isn't about where you come from, but about where you're going. The crowd erupted into applause. Michael, watching from the back, felt his chest swell with pride. This was the true legacy, not money, not prestige, but change. And it all started with a decision. Richard Kensington sat in his study, a glass of expensive whiskey in hand. The room was dimly lit, the only sound being the faint crackling of the fireplace. He stared at an invitation lying on his desk, the Carter Foundation Gala. It had been sent to him personally. Sarah and Ethan had left a seat open for him, but he didn't go, because if he did, he would have to acknowledge that he had been wrong. Eleanor entered the room quietly, watching him for a moment before speaking. You should have been there, she said. Richard exhaled, but said nothing. Eleanor shook her head. You've already lost her, she whispered. But you still have a chance to fix this. She turned and walked away, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if his pride was worth the cost. The Grand Kensington estate was eerily silent. Once, it had been the center of Newport's high society, a place where business moguls, politicians, and aristocrats gathered for lavish events. Now, it felt emptier than ever. Richard Kensington sat alone in his study, staring at a financial report that detailed what he had refused to believe for months. His company, Kensington Enterprises, was declining. It wasn't an immediate collapse. No, it was a slow, painful erosion, one that came not from external forces, but from within. Decades of arrogance, of believing that his name alone was enough, had begun to catch up with him. And the worst part? People were talking. For the first time in his life, Richard Kensington was not the most powerful man in the room. It started subtly. A few investors pulled out. A couple of board members expressed concerns about the company's outdated strategies. Then, clients who had once begged for his attention suddenly began looking elsewhere, toward newer, more innovative competitors. And Ethan Carter, his name was everywhere. News articles hailed the Carter Foundation as a game changer for young entrepreneurs. Sarah and Ethan were featured in Forbes, speaking about their mission to provide opportunities for people who, like Ethan, had come from nothing. Even Michael Carter, the man Richard had mocked, was suddenly being praised. A blue-collar worker, a simple garage owner, was being spoken about with admiration and respect. And Richard, he was no longer relevant. At one of the last high-profile events he attended, he overheard whispers, "Kensington Enterprises is losing ground. They're stuck in the past." Did you see the Carter Foundation's latest initiative? That's the future. Maybe Richard Kensington isn't as powerful as he thought he was. The words burned. For a man who had spent his entire life controlling his world, losing that control was unbearable. Eleanor had insisted they host a dinner party. She believed that if they reminded the right people of their social standing, they could reverse the tide. The guests arrived, CEOs, investors, politicians, all dressed in their finest. The wine was expensive, the food meticulously prepared, but the atmosphere was tense. Because even here, in his own home, Richard was no longer the most influential man in the rooms. It became painfully obvious when the conversation turned to the Carter Foundation. "I attended their gala last month," one guest mentioned, swirling his wine. "Quite impressive. Ethan and Sarah have built something meaningful." Eleanor forced a smile. "Of course," she said smoothly. "But let's not forget that running a charity is very different from running an actual business." There were polite chuckles, but the guest simply shrugged. "Maybe, but they're making a real impact. That's something people respect these days." Richard clenched his jaw. That night, as the guests left, Eleanor watched him carefully. "They're talking about them," she said quietly. Richard didn't respond, because deep down, he knew. They weren't just talking. They were choosing sides. And for the first time, Richard Kensington was on the wrong side. Richard sat in his study, long after Eleanor had gone to bed. The invitation to the Carter Foundation's next event still lay on his desk. He hadn't thrown it away, but he hadn't accepted it either. A part of him, the stubborn part, wanted to ignore it, to pretend that none of this mattered. But another part, the part that had watched Sarah walk away from him, was beginning to wonder if he had made a mistake. For days, Richard Kensington wrestled with a thought that refused to leave his mind. Had he truly lost his daughter? Not just to Ethan Carter, but to something far worse, his own stubbornness, his own arrogance. The world around him had changed, but he had refused to change with it. And now, he was beginning to pay the price. Sitting alone in his study, surrounded by remnants of a legacy he once controlled, Richard stared at the invitation to the Carter Foundation's next charity gala. He had a choice to make. He could ignore it, remain trapped in his pride, and watch as his influence continued to crumble. Or he could swallow his ego, seek out his daughter, and try, just once, to understand the path she had chosen. For the first time in his life, Richard Kensington felt something foreign: doubt. The Carter Foundation's charity gala was held in one of Newport's most prestigious hotels, the kind that Richard had once frequented effortlessly. Now, as he arrived alone, stepping out of his chauffeured car, he felt like an outsider. People recognized him, of course, but instead of admiration, he was met with curiosity. Why is Richard Kensington here? Is he finally admitting Ethan was right? He straightened his tie, pushed his shoulders back, and walked through the entrance. If he was going to swallow his pride, he would do so on his own terms. Inside, the event was already in full swing. The ballroom was filled with powerful figures, business leaders, innovators, philanthropists, many of whom had once courted his favor. Now they gravitated elsewhere, to Ethan Carter, to Sarah, to Michael Carter, the very man Richard had mocked. The sight of Michael, standing comfortably among Newport's elite, engaged in deep conversation with investors, stung more than Richard was willing to admit. This was not the world he had envisioned, but it was the world that was moving forward, with or without him. And then he saw her. Sarah, his daughter. She stood beside Ethan, laughing softly as they spoke to a group of young entrepreneurs. She looked happy, happier than she had ever looked under his roof. Richard's chest tightened. For years he had told himself that everything he did was for her. But now, watching her from afar, he realized the ugly truth. He had never truly listened, and now he might be too late. Summoning his courage, Richard approached. Sarah caught sight of him first. The warmth in her eyes faded. Ethan turned next, his expression unreadable, but guarded. Silence fell between them, thick with unspoken words. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Dad." A single word, but the weight behind it was crushing. "Sarah," Richard began, his voice tighter than he intended. You're here." She cut him off, crossing her arms. "Why?" Richard hesitated. For the first time, he didn't have an answer. Why was he here? To save face? To make amends? Did he even deserve the chance? "I wanted to see you," he admitted. Sarah studied him, eyes sharp, unreadable. "You wanted to see me," she repeated, her voice laced with skepticism. He nodded. Sarah exhaled sharply. "Let me guess," she said. "You've realized you were wrong, and now you want to, what? Fix everything? No. Pretend the last few years didn't happen?" Her words cut deep, because they were true. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight," Richard said, his voice lower now, almost vulnerable. "But I do expect you to know that I regret the way things happened." Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "Regret," she echoed. "You regret what exactly, Dad? That I left? That I found happiness without your approval? That Ethan turned out to be the better man?" The words stung, but Richard didn't argue. Because for the first time, he wasn't here to win. He was here to listen. Michael Carter appeared beside them. His expression was calm, unreadable, but there was no hostility. "Richard," he greeted. "Didn't expect to see you here." Richard's jaw tightened. He had once dismissed Michael as insignificant. Now, standing here, as equals, he felt the weight of his own misjudgment. "You were right," Richard admitted. Michael raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Richard exhaled. "About everything." Sarah blinked, clearly taken aback. Even Ethan looked surprised. "I was wrong about you," Richard continued, turning to Michael. "And I was wrong about Ethan. About everything that happened at the wedding. About how I treated you both." The room seemed to hold its breath. Sarah studied her father carefully. "And?" she prompted. Richard's gaze softened. "And I want to make it right," he admitted. For the first time in years, Sarah saw something new in her father's eyes. Humility. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to tell him it was too late. But as much as she hated to admit it, a part of her still wanted to believe in him. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Sarah spoke. "People don't change overnight, Dad," she said. "If you want to be in my life, in our lives, you're going to have to prove it." Richard nodded. "I will." A decade had passed. A decade since that night at the Carter Foundation Gala. A decade since Richard Kensington had stood before his daughter, asking for a second chance. Not just a chance to rebuild their relationship, but to redefine his own legacy. And tonight, as the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the Kensington estate in hues of amber and gold, Richard stood at the doorway of a home that no longer felt like his own, because it wasn't. The living room was alive with laughter, warmth, and something that had once felt foreign in this house: love. Ethan stood at the kitchen counter, pouring wine into crystal glasses, his movements effortless, as if he had always belonged here. Sarah, radiant as ever, sat on the couch, one arm draped around their 7-year-old son, Lucas, and at the heart of it all, Michael Carter. Still strong, still unchanged, and yet everything about him commanded respect, in a way that money never could. It was a scene that Richard would have once rejected outright, but now he was simply grateful to be a part of it. "Grandpa!" Lucas's voice rang out excitedly. "Come look at my drawing." Richard smiled, making his way over, peering down at the paper. It was a family portrait: Sarah, Ethan, Lucas, and him. His breath caught in his throat. How had he gotten here? How had he gone from the controlling patriarch of an empire to a man who found true wealth in moments like these? Michael rose from his chair, walking toward the grand fireplace, where a single wrapped gift rested against the mantel. "This," he said, turning toward Richard, "is for you." Richard blinked, caught off guard. "For me?" Michael nodded. Sarah and Ethan exchanged a knowing glance. Richard hesitated before reaching forward, carefully unwrapping the gift. The moment he saw it, his breath hitched. It was a painting, not a lavish, expensive artwork from an elite artist, but one that was unmistakably handmade, a portrait of the entire family: Michael, Ethan, Sarah, Lucas, and him. "I don't understand," Richard murmured. Michael smiled. "I figured you've spent your life chasing the wrong kind of legacy," he said. "So, I thought maybe it was time for a new one." Richard stared at the painting for a long moment. Once, he had measured his worth in the power he wielded, in the influence his name carried, in the way people bowed to him in fear. But here, in this room, surrounded by the very people he had once dismissed, he had never felt richer. I don't know what to say," Richard admitted. Michael chuckled. "Then don't say anything," he said. "Just don't live it." As the night carried on, the air was filled with stories, laughter, and a sense of completion. For the first time, Richard didn't feel like a relic of the past. He felt like a man with a future. Not the kind written in business ledgers or newspaper headlines, but the kind that lived within the hearts of the people he loved. And as he watched Lucas crawl onto Michael's lap, his small fingers tracing the old mechanic's calloused hands, Richard finally understood. The legacy that mattered wasn't in fortune or power. It was in family, and in the quiet moments that lasted a lifetime. Is it the wealth we leave behind? The status we build? Or is it something deeper? The love we give? The lives we touch? The moments that define who we truly are? Tell me in the comments, what's the greatest lesson you've learned about family, respect, or resilience? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notifications. We have more powerful stories coming. Stories that will challenge the way we see the world. Stories that remind us that in the end, what truly matters isn't what we own, but who we become. I'll see you in the next one. Stay inspired. Love.